Hey everybody, Paul Mack here, and I've got another viewer question. This one comes from Andrew McDonald 7077, and Andrew writes, Paul Mack, additionally, I'd like to see a video on different techniques to salvage wasted hay. My herd conservatively wastes up to 25%. It's terrible. Daily raking up waste and drying it in a rick of some sort of elevated cage construction with narrow holes, horse feed bags suspended from T-posts, etc. I'm sure there are many excellent ideas out there. I'm just struggling and would welcome any and all ideas to make my dollar stretch further. So Andrew, are you talking about round bales or square bales? Probably round bales. Square bales are usually used in an effort to save more hay, to conserve more hay, because you can feed them out specifically at specific times and in specific amounts, and it saves a lot of waste. I'll talk more about square bales in just a minute, but Andrew, yes, you are right. Feeding hay is an area where sometimes our money is leaking out of our pockets and we don't even realize. It's almost imperceptible. Hay is probably my biggest, well, it's not probably, it's my biggest expense on the farm, because at the moment I don't produce enough hay to meet my hay needs. I buy it from a very reputable and a very good outside source, but it is my biggest expense. And let me tell you something, it hurts to the core, when I see these large animals that I love and I care for daily, and they grab with their mouth huge chunks of hay and just fling it out in all directions, and they could care less where it lands. They step on it, manure it, soil it, and just keep grabbing more out and flinging it and eating whatever remains in their mouth and doesn't get flung all over the ground. That hurts, and that's a waste. You know, you'd think after all the care and time you put into these animals that they would go over and they would realize, hey, that's still a good flake of hay, and they would pick it up. They don't. They could care less. I don't know why that is. And it hurts, as I said. So what can you do about it? Well, several things. We'll talk about the round bales first. To feed the round bales, I use a hay ring, as most people do. It's just, mine are made of metal, and you put the ring around the round bale, and it keeps the cattle from, well, it seems to keep the cattle from pulling as much out as they would normally, just tearing the bale apart. It kind of keeps them at a distance there around the bale, but enough room to reach through the bars and grab what they need, and then fling a bunch on the ground. So what I do, and this is part of my daily chores, actually morning and evening chores, it's just a habit, it's routine, it's part of my existence on this planet, is to go around morning and evening. I call it dressing up the bale, where I take a pitchfork or a yard broom, and I use a yard broom if it's kind of loosely scattered around, but you can do it with a pitchfork, and I'll kind of draw up the hay into little piles all around the bales. And if you'll do this, if you're studious to do it morning and evening, just part of your routine, then you don't have to do it, wait several days and do it, because you'll end up wasting more hay because they'll trample it and, you know, mess it up further. So you want to get it morning and evening when it's still in good nutritional shape, condition. This is also the time where I go around, incidentally, with a wheelbarrow and a manure fork, and I'm gathering up the piles of manure to put on the garden. So both chores done, you know, morning and evening. That way you don't save it up for a long marathon where you're hauling manure and raking up loose hay all in one day and it wears you out. A little bit every day, morning and evening, helps a lot. As I said, I mainly use a pitchfork, normally a 4-tine pitchfork. A three tine will work, two tine is better than nothing. But keep in mind that those tines, the more tines you have on there, it grabs and holds the hay better. And so that's because I'm usually walking a long distance to take it, you know, wherever I'm going to take it. I'll talk about that in a second. And also, something that most people aren't aware of, and it makes a difference. If you'll sharpen those tines of the pitchfork to, you know, I'm not needle sharp or anything, you're not going to sew with it, but if you'll sharpen them pretty well, they'll actually go through the hay a lot better. You'll be surprised at what a dull pitchfork will do and what a sharper pitchfork will do. That's just incidental. I threw that in there. Now, when I do this, when I dress up the bale, there's usually 3 types of hay or there can be, I should say, 3 types of hay laying on the ground. There's the clean, dry hay that's, still got a lot of nutritional value. They've just pulled it out of the mouth and it's laying there on the ground. There's the damp hay if it's just rained or whatever and over the night, or since the last time I dressed it up, and it's moist hay. Or there's soiled hay that they've pooped, peed on, or whatever, and it's not ideal, but still hay. So those 3 conditions. Here's what I do with the clean, dry hay that I gather up. If the hay bale is maybe more than halfway gone, I can gather that loose, clean hay up and just put it back on top of the ring, or back in the middle of the ring where they can keep pulling it out and keep wasting it. At least they'll eat a little more of it. Or I keep my bull on the other side of the fence. If I'm feeding the cows, what the bull is good for, just one thing once a year. And so he's pretty much on the other side of the fence, and I feed him off dressing down the bale so that he's not just standing there all day eating, which is what he's apt to do. And so I feed him what I dress down off the bale, but I have to get it on the fork and then carry it across the fence. It's ideal to feed him good, clean, dry hay. The other thing that you can do with the good, clean hay is feed other livestock that you had. You can feed chickens if you've got chickens, or rabbits. Of course, they're not going to eat, huge amounts of it. But again, it's something to be fed to the other animals you have. Sheep, goats, chickens will eat it. Even hogs will eat that clean hay. The other thing that I do with the clean hay is I personally, next to where I'm feeding that round bale, I have a couple of hoop houses that at the moment I'm not using. I built them for, as portable chicken coops, or greenhouse if I needed it, cover it with plastic or whatever. And originally I had some goats in there, that love-hate story. But now that they're sitting empty there, and they've got tarps on them to shed the rain off of them. So I take that loose, dry hay, and I've got some wooden pallets sitting in the hoop houses, and I'll take that loose, dry hay and just pile it up in the hoop house. And so at the end of this round bale, if maybe it's raining or whatever, and I can't get out there that day to put the new bale out there with a tractor, I might feed them off of that dry hay that's in the hoop house until I can get the tractor out there with a new bale. Or at the end of that bale, if it's summertime and I'm still, I don't have enough grass, but I'm moving the cows around, if they finish that bale, I can rotate them around on grass. Meanwhile, I'm feeding the bull, since there's no hay left in the hay ring, I'm feeding the bull from out of that hoop house with the dry, clean hay that I've gathered up and stored in there. So you can just store it. And maybe you don't have a hoop house, but maybe you've got an extra shed, or maybe you can just put some pallets there and put a tarp over it and fasten it down so the wind doesn't blow it away. Just whatever, sheds the rain off of it for a short period of time, because it's not going to be there all year, probably, if you're using it that way. So the next thing, soiled hay. I'll talk about soiled hay. What do you do with soiled hay? You're going around and maybe a lot of the hay you gather up is dry and in good condition, and you take that, put it in your hoop house or your shed, or feed it to other animals. But then there's always invariably some of the hay that you can obviously see the cow has pooped on and peed on or whatever. And it's not ideal. If you put that in the hoop house on top of the dry hay, it's going to kind of mold, and it's going to make the good hay not so good anymore. So what do you do with that? Well, I raise hogs, as you probably well know, and so I'll feed a lot of that soiled hay to the hogs. Here's a little secret about hogs. They don't care. They will actually prefer that, because hogs are not, they're smart. They're just not the cleanest animal, as you're probably aware of. But they will make good use of that hay and turn it into pork, ham, bacon, anything else that you desire. Wonderful animal, the hog. You can also take that soiled hay, and if you've got a farrowing pen, if you're into raising hogs, you can put it into their little pens, or if you've got a little hog house for them to farrow in, you can put that in there. And even though it's moist and soiled, they don't seem to care. It's better than the damp ground, so they'll like it. You can use it as bedding in the little farrowing pen. A lot of people aren't aware of this, but chickens are kind of like hogs. They don't seem to care too much about what they eat either. I've fed them kitchen scraps, and you can put that soiled hay in there, and they'll pick through that. They'll even, and if you get a little bit of manure in there, they'll pick through that manure and find undigested grain. Really, they're good at turning those into eggs. Here's the other thing. If you have larger amounts of soiled hay, you can certainly use that as mulch around fruit trees in your orchard. It makes a great mulch. You don't want to pile it right up against the trunk, but away, kind of form a bowl. But it makes a really good mulch for fruit trees. Now, as you probably know, in my garden, I let one section rest every year, and that's my plan for fertility, or one of the huge parts of my fertility plan is one section of my garden does not get planted each year. And about this time, about the fall and through the winter of the year, I will take the manure as I gather it from around the round bale or wherever I found it. See, the manure seems to, the cows are all around the round bale through the winter, and so that's where a majority of the manure is going to be. And I get about a half a wheelbarrow per animal per day, which is quite a lot since I keep 3 to 4 to 5 large animals out there. And so I'll take that manure and pile it on those resting sections of the garden. But here's the thing, with that soiled hay that you're gathering up from around the round bale, you can cart that to the garden and spread it over those manure piles in the section that's resting, and it sits there, all winter and all spring and summer of the next year because it's resting. And by the time the next year rolls around and you're ready to plant, all that has pretty much decomposed on top of the ground. The worms are there, they love it, and that section is ready to plant with your corn or whatever heavy nitrogen feeding plant you want to plant there. So another good thing that you can do with soiled hay. Soiled hay is not wasted, which is a wonderful, wonderful thought since you've paid for it. Now, the third type of hay is the hay that's not soiled, it's not dry, it's just maybe been rained on. Maybe you had a shower through the night or a heavy rain, and the hay is laying there outside the ring in large quantities, but it's just wet. It's not dirty, it's not soiled, and it's certainly not dry. What can you do with that? Well, before it starts to mold, which, that could be like 3-4 days before it starts having that particular moldy smell, you can go ahead, I can feed that to the bull right then. He doesn't seem to mind if it's wet as long as it's, within a day or two. And you can also, again, you can feed it small amounts to the chickens, to the hogs if you need to. And like in the soiled hay, you can also use it for mulch if you need mulch around a fruit tree or on your garden. But fourthly, you can attempt to dry that hay out. Further north from here, up in our northern states, hay ricks were a common thing. If the weather is not as hot and dry as you need it to be, which I guess can be the case in your northern states, they would build wooden racks. Basically, I don't know, it's kind of like a triangle. I guess there's several different ways you can build one, but they would pile that loose hay on top of that so that it would get airflow. Hay ricks weren't really used in the South that I had been aware of. I guess because the South is so much hotter, the heat is so much more intense and can be so much drier in those haymaking months, June, July, August, that they weren't really needed because it's just so hot down here. It's like you got a hairdryer going the whole time you're out there making hay, especially if you got a dry wind. And so they weren't really used in the South. So what you can do if you're in the South, you can just spread that wet hay out on the ground so that it's almost like it's back in the field drying. You've had a shower on fresh mowed hay, and you can come out, and if you've got after the rain, you've got a dry day or two, you can come out and kind of fluff it up, make it into windrows, turn it over a time or two through the hot day or the next day. Now, you might lose some nutritional value, but again, it's still better than feeding snowballs to your cattle. So you might lose some, but it's hay. They can still eat it, and you will have preserved it from getting moldy, hopefully. In the northern states, you can still use the hay ricks or just build a sawhorse or whatever you want and just lay that hay on that so that airflow gets in there and it can dry out a little more. And perhaps you've preserved some of it to some extent and saved some of that nutritional value. I mentioned square bales earlier, and as we talked about, the square bales are usually used sometimes in an effort to save hay because you can feed them very particularly at certain times, and you can be very conscientious about the amount you feed so that none is wasted. And that's what makes square bales so handy. What makes square bales not so handy is that you've got to manually move those things around and feed the animals rather than just putting a round bale out once every couple of weeks or how often and letting them eat the thing down. Now, sometimes they can waste hay. Animals can waste hay off a square bale. Well, what can you do about that? As Andrew mentioned, he did mention the hay bags or hay nets, and those are for sale in farm supply catalogs or stores. It's basically a net bag that you can hang from the ceiling of the stall or whatever, and you can fill that thing with hay. It's basically a big net holding hay, and the holes are big enough that the hay are small enough the hay doesn't fall out, and big enough that they can reach in with their mouth. And because that thing is swinging, it's harder for them to grab more of it and just fling it and waste it. So whatever they get in their mouth, they'll usually chew it up and eat it. So it wastes less. Those can be good ideas. The other thing, the more traditional method of feeding square bales would be a hay rack and a manger that I used to see in just about every barn when I was growing up. And I built one in my first barn there in Tennessee, and it was very, very useful. Basically, it's I use saplings. You can, I guess you can cut slender boards and do the same thing, but it's just go cut some saplings that are bigger than a broomstick, maybe 1.5 inches or something like that. And you can mount a 2x board kind of down low, maybe about this high, and drill holes in it with an auger, holes that are slightly smaller than the diameter of the sapling. And then you whittle down the edge, the ends of that sapling so that it's tapered, so that it fits in the hole. And then there's a frame mounted up higher, that comes out about 2 foot, 18 inches, whatever you want, from the wall. And so those poles are slanted, and you can just nail those poles into the framework above. And the idea is that you can feed the hay down from the loft. All you got to do is climb the loft, which it can be inconvenient because you got to climb up there every day to feed your animals, twice a day actually, or however often you feed them, and pitch the hay down from a hole in the loft above. And the racks are at a slant so that they can come and pull out, and they're spaced, about, something like that, about that far apart, and they're spaced where the animal can pull that hay out. Now, one thing that's very handy is that if you build a manger underneath that rack, that's the width of the rack, and basically the manger is just a box with a bottom in it, and as they're chewing and eating, a lot of debris from hay falls down, and if there's not a box there to catch it, it'll just fall on the ground, and they're not going to pick that up off the ground. Animals are particular about that, most of them. And so that debris will fall, those little pieces of hay and grass will fall in that manger, and if it's in the manger, on that clean, wooden bottom to the manger, they will eat that too if they get hungry enough and finish everything else up. So that's a very, very good way of conserving that square bale hay. And it's fun to build. You should build one. You'd love it. Now, if you have a question or a comment, please feel free to leave it in the comment section below. Maybe you have methods of saving wasted hay, or maybe you have other things that you can do that you figured out you can do with wasted hay. Make a scarecrow, get a shirt and some overalls and make you a scarecrow. Stuff that thing with hay. Use your imagination, but tell us about it in the comment section below. I love reading those, and everybody else does too. Also, you may like to watch my playlist on making old-fashioned hay, since that's kind of what we talked about today in some small way. I'll have that link at the end of the video and in the description. Also, you might enjoy my video on, what's it called? How much hay does it take to feed cattle? How much hay does it take to feed cattle? There's some pretty good information in there that I think you might find valuable. So give that a watch. I'll have that at the end of the video, that link, and I'll have it in the description. Meanwhile, that's all I've got for today. Thank you for being with me. I'm Paul Mack, and I will talk at you next time. Brett Kales, my granddad believed and followed the signs religiously. He almost always had a good garden and produced a lot. My great uncle, his brother, always said, I plant my seeds in the ground, not in the signs. And he almost always had a good garden. So, I have no idea what works. Well, Brett, I can tell you what doesn't work. Not planting.